Alright guys, time for another game theory video. I've been getting asked to do some game theory videos again. If you like these videos, like, sub, silly, comment, share, support the channel if you want to. Although a little bit of an asterisk mark there are memberships now. You get absolutely nothing for memberships except you get a Pikachu emoji. And I saw some guy as a Patreon, but I guess he wants to donate $5 or something like that, but he doesn't actually want to defend me in public for real and call out haters. So if you're one of those guys, I would actually prefer you do not donate. So to that guy, I'm just going to delete his Patreon probably. And if anyone else ever wants to donate to the channel, I would actually prefer you are a man and you call out people for lying rather than you give me $5. Right? I mean, so anyway. So what is the topic today? I get asked about this sometimes, and it's kind of a hard video, I think, to do almost, because I know my knee-jerk reaction. So take this game theory with a grain of salt, because it's mostly a knee-jerk reaction, and that is, what is the most important thing when determining a character's tier on the tier list, right? And instantly, my knee-jerk reaction is always damage is the most important. If a character or characters are in the vicinity of each other on a tier list, again, my knee-jerk reaction, and I say knee-jerk reaction because it's instantly what I think of, but I know I can give arguments to myself that would defeat that argument to an extent. So it's hard for me to totally come at this from an intelligent way because even tiers themselves can be so broad and nuanced when you're giving a discussion about an intelligent conversation, I should say, about tier lists. But let's give my knee-jerk reaction what I would talk about or think about when I think about tier lists. And, we're comparing like, oh, well, maybe a character has super crazy mix-ups, they do lesser damage, versus a character that is in the same vicinity, but less mix-up and big damage. And my instant knee-jerk reaction is always the character that does more damage is always going to be better, right? Let's look at a few games when we think about this again. With a grain of salt, my knee-jerk reaction. Let's look at a game like Karnov's Revenge. But we're going to talk about a few games, but Karnov's Revenge is an interesting game if you think about tier lists from this perspective, because Karnov's Revenge has a meta that is not in other fighting games. You have that meta of how much damage your character does, but there also is the how much damage your character can take meta that is not part of other games, because it is such a integral part of the game. Where is your character's dizzy spot, right? Can they protect their dizzy spot, right? Such an integral part about the game, right? Let's look at this through a few examples, right? Because you might say, when I've given my tier list for Karnov's Revenge, I often say Zazie is the cheapest character in the game, but Ray is the best. And you might be like, well, Clayton, you just said, you know what I mean, if we're to look at this, that you always lean towards the character that does more damage is better in the tier list. And when you look at a game like Karnov's Revenge, the top four is generally, people say, a mixture of Ray, Lee, Zazie, Karnov, right? And this is where a game like Karnov's Revenge is interesting in that theory, because Karnov's Revenge has that meta that is not in other games of how much damage can my character take, right? Because if you just look at that, Ray is the weakest character of all those characters, for sure. But it has the meta. Ray is one of the only characters in the game who has a very serendipitously, coincidentally enough, small ducking animation. It is quite hard to one-shot Ray with some characters. And his ducking animation also serendipitously, coincidentally enough, protects his dizzy spot. So he is not one-shotted as much. That's why I always say that even though Karnov is so fucking good in that game, Karnov eats hits. He has a terrible dizzy spot. We also have the idea that it just so coincidentally, serendipitously happens that Ray, normally a weaker character in terms of damage out of these top tier characters, you might get 40% from a dynamite tackle. Dynamite tackle combos, well, you know what? They do a lot of damage versus characters like Karnov, like Lee, like Gene, who is right below that top tier in his own tier, that fifth spot. So serendipitously, coincidentally enough, Ray actually does good damage to the other top tiers. And it, coincidentally enough, can hit some of the other top tiers to dizzy them. Ray actually has potential to one-shot, basically, because they'll get dizzy some of the top tier characters. So he can win off a couple of mistakes. Right? We can look at this matchup wise as well. Let's look at a tier. So we have that top 4, then you have the Gene tier. Then we have that next tier, right? And I'm going to do other games besides Karnov's Revenge if people don't care about Karnov's, but Karnov's is just interesting in terms of this aspect, I think. We have the next tier. We have that Samche Yummy Mizoguchi tier, right? I think that, and I've said this before, if you were to just look at the game like the game of characters being solid, Samche, because a lot of people will argue about Samche and Mizoguchi or whatever, and they're who is better than who, right? And that's another clear example of an idea of people only say Mizoguchi because he does more damage. Because if you look at the game in terms of being solid, Mizoguchi is actually a pretty shitty character. In a game where fireballs are so powerful with so many characters, Mizoguchi has the worst fireball in the game. Mizoguchi's Dragon Punch sucks. Now, again, you got context of the game. Context is king here. Mizoguchi's Dragon Punch compared to a lot of other Dragon Punches in the game is not that good. It's one of the most punishable Dragon Punches. It's one of the least invincible, right? Mizoguchi has a lot of weaknesses in terms of being a solid character. But compared to Samche, Mizoguchi does excel at the coin flip nature of Karnov's Revenge. A lower level player to a higher level player can potentially do a lot of damage off a random DP, off a random hurricane kick, right? Something that Samche is incredibly more solid than a character like Mizoguchi does not have access to, right? I mean, the difference between like a high-level Mizoguchi, you know what I mean? It's like, before I was playing him, all those things that I was doing with Mizoguchi were considered video combo stuff, you know what I mean? That was stuff you could not do in real matches, right? Like when I played the game, there was only a couple other Japanese that even attempted to do some of that stuff, and it was only when they were dizzy. And to this day, I've never seen anyone ever play him to the level that I did, where I showed you can actually aim dizzy spots and do it off of random hits, right? That's like the difference. But at a lower level, I'm saying, the whole coin flip nature of Mizoguchi doing a lot of damage potentially is very high. That's why he's in the same tier, right? If we were to look at, say, Mizoguchi, let's use this as an example too, just to go back to the top tier. If you were to look at a character like Zazie, one of the most scrub-a-dub characters ever in a fighting game, right? But if we were to look at that matchup between him and Mizoguchi, right? Mizoguchi might be able to win that Zazie matchup off a coin flip, because the meta of how much damage can I take exists in Karnov's that does not exist in other games. Because Mizoguchi can potentially kill Zazie, one-shot him, off a mistake, right? Whereas a character like Ray, the meta of the game, Ray takes damage well. It is very hard for Mizoguchi to one-shot Ray. Realistically speaking, most times in real match, the only time you can even attempt to hit Ray and do it is if you are punishing a fireball from a jump light little punch. After you hit the little punch, depending on where you are, if Ray ducks, it is possible from certain positions to go aim for a dizzy spot from a certain air hurricane kick combo. But generally speaking, it's very difficult to one-shot Ray, because you're just not in a position to ever do it. And he takes damage well, and even if you get dizzy, doing a full triple loop hurricane kick combo on Ray, if he ducks, is extremely, extremely difficult. Nigh impossible, right? Because you have to do the hard kick version as well, which is even more difficult and actually does a little bit less damage. But, we're getting to very specific things. And then if we were to go down to the bottom of the tier list, we have characters like Ryoko and Phelan. Fuck, they're both terrible characters in the meta of the game. But You know what? I've said before, you know what? I don't know if I would say that Phelan is better than Ryoko, because even if Ryoko gets raped by some characters, Ryoko, there's the whole idea of when you see people talk about this game, there's people, they try to get clout to be like, oh, I won with Ryoko. It's like you hit 3 throws. Are you want a pat on your back? You killed the person because her throw does so much damage. She can randomly win in 3 throws. That's her character, right? Phelan has no damage whatsoever. No damage. Even if she might be a little more solid than Ryoko, it just, it's hard for me to believe. My knee jerk reaction is I will always say the character that does more damage is a better character if they are in the vicinity of the tier list, right? And I know tier lists, there's a lot of nuance when we talk about it, because how are we, is this the highest level? How much leeway are we giving? And a lot of people, when they talk about tier lists, they're not even being realistic. They'll make a tier list based off their own insecurities about what they think is possible in a game, right? Again, we could use Karnov's again. Mizuguchi was not even considered as good as he was until I showed that he could be played to that level, right? Let's look at another game. Let's look at some Guilty Gears, right? If we look at Guilty Gear XX for an example, right? Generally, the bottom characters were considered, I think the bottom 3 were generally Kai, Angie, and Zappa. And then I think right above that, there was a mixture of, I want to say it was generally something like Testament, May, right? Maybe Jammer, Potemkin. I forget exactly what the tier list was, and I've always said, I'm a firm believer that Kai was actually the worst character in that game. Maybe Kai was generally rated the 3rd or the 4th worst character in that game, but I generally lean to Kai as the worst character in Guilty Gear XX because he does no damage. Kai has 1 damaging combo, and it's only that forward kick loop, and it only works on ducking characters, and he actually had nothing that could set it up in that game. He had no combo that knocked you down. He had nothing damage-wise in that game, basically. At least Angie, if he had meter, he could do some big damaging combos off of Unblockable, right? Specific, but there. Angie actually could fucking hurt you, okay? Zappa. People say Zappa sucks, and Zappa, Guilty Gear has a lot of different interesting characters, right? But Zappa. Is Zappa really worse than Kai? Zappa has the whole idea that Zappa's one of the only characters maybe in fighting game history that there is a very clear-cut idea that Zappa is the worst character in the game right when he first starts off, because he doesn't have a summon yet. And then his, position in the tier list or the matchup specifically changes depending on what summon he gets. But at least Zappa, theoretically, even if he starts the match off at the disadvantage, his potential is higher than Kai. And his damage is potentially more significant than Kai by a wide margin. Zappa can win matches he probably shouldn't, right? Kai just does no damage in the game. That's why I'm the pick. Kai's the worst character in that game. My knee-jerk reaction is always to lean to the character that does more damage is going to be better than the other character when they're in the same vicinity. Let's look at a game like Slash. Generally, the best characters in the game were considered Kai and Soul, right? That's actually not my opinion. I'm actually of the opinion, if the game was ever played long enough and more optimally speaking, I think that Johnny was probably arguably the best character in the game, actually. I also think Melia was actually very strong in that game as well. But arguably speaking, I think if the game would have kept being played at the highest level, Johnny is potentially the best character in that game. But talking about Kai and Soul, a lot of people complain that Kai is scrub-a-dub, and maybe he is, compared to other games. But the thing is, if you look at tournaments, Kai's never won any big tournaments in Slash in Japan. All the Kais lost the biggest tournaments in Japan. Doesn't matter how good Kai was in that game. No Kai won any big tournament whatsoever. But Soul still won. Other characters still won because you know what? Kai he didn't do a ton of damage. That's why Soul was actually better. That's why Soul won more than Kai. Because again, I said it before, my knee-jerk reaction is even if a character is more solid, maybe more tricky whatsoever, the character that does more damage tends to be better. Right? If we look at a game like Street Fighter, Super Turbo. Super Turbo could be potentially an interesting game. Super Turbo, you might have to look at this a little bit more broad, right? Again, Super Turbo, potentially the most balanced game of all time, right? You know, if you think about it from the perspective of that, not in terms of there's nothing cheap, quotation marks cheap, but if you look at the game and you think that, wow, at a competitive level, every character basically can be played. Maybe not every super version or Super Turbo version of it, but generally speaking, every character has been played at some point or another competitively. Both versions, right? You could say that as well as because Super Turbo is a game that is so volatile, because damage is so big, it is a balancing thing in a sense, right? Super Turbo, it could be an example of a game, one of these rare exceptions where the best character in the game is not the character that does the most damage. I mean, if we're to look at, and I guess it could be, I don't know exactly what people say is the best character in Super Turbo nowadays. Generally speaking, I would say it's probably, like Dalsum. A lot of people say Vega. I don't think Old Sagat is generally considered top 2 though, right? Is he? I mean, I'm not sure exactly what the community thinks about it nowadays, but Old Sagat is a more volatile character than potentially, a Dalsum or a Vega. But that a Super Turbo could be a sort of exception to the rule that a character like Dalsum or Vega might be considered the best in the game, and they're certainly not the most volatile characters in the game. But of course there's also characters like, Balrog. Balrog is obviously very damaging. Again, Super Turbo would be an interesting idea about this because it could be quite nuanced, really, when you think about it. But if we're speaking about counter character stuff, a good example of this, of why damage is so important in tiers is, and I've always said this is funny, when you think about, there's this idea that people talk about counter characters and everything. I'm not saying that counter characters don't exist, but let's look at the Ryu versus E Honda matchup, right? Generally considered, Shoto's beat E Honda, right? But it's funny, as the years have gone on, it's funny when you think about games like Super Turbo. Back in the day, it was usually, and a lot of this, I've talked about this before, is that people sensationalize things, right? So back in the day, Ryu versus Honda used to just be like, 6.5, 3.5. It was a good advantage, right? And it's funny that nowadays you will see some people talk about like, oh, Ryu versus Honda, it's 8-2. And it's like, dude, Honda has gotten better as the years have gone on, right? As the game has progressed, you know what I mean? And like I said, I've said this before, progression of skill and competitive stuff can be slightly hazy in fighting games because certainly although the games have progressed, there are certain fundamental skills that people are generally not as good at anymore. But for sake of argument, Honda is a character that has progressed tech-wise throughout the years, people doing option selects and everything like that. So it's funny that people say that the Honda-Ryu matchup is worse for Honda, when Honda has only gotten better as the years have gone on since the game came out, right? And it's also funny that people say that because you see Hondas regularly beat Ryus in Japan that I see. It sure as fuck doesn't look 8-2. And it's because the damage factor is so big in a game like Super Turbo. Slowly killing Honda, it doesn't matter how much of a counter character you are. And I'm not saying Ryu's not a potential counter character, but it is very hard for me to believe that Ryu doing the damage that he does to Honda beats Honda 8-2 in the meta of the game when Honda has more, Honda has progressed throughout the meta of the years. It's ridiculous. And it's because Honda does more damage. He's progressed, the Ochio tick loops and all that kind of stuff. You're safe, blah, blah, blah. Just like you think about characters like T-Hawk, whatever. He's really progressed throughout the years. You know what I mean? He gets in, he throws you to death. You die very fast, right? I mean, so damage is, I always feel like damage is a huge factor in games, dude. When I think about tier lists, right? And I that is my knee jerk reaction, that it doesn't matter how complicated your character is, how solid your character is. If the character does more damage, my knee jerk reaction, and again, I say knee jerk because I feel like this is a conversation that could go on a while to talk about it more intelligently. But again, the knee jerk reaction is the character that does more damage is always going to be better. Again, you got to think about, well, what if we're playing optimally, all this kind of stuff. And it's like, well, how much leeway do we get into optimally? And of course, again, for sure, for people, they don't, you know, a lot of times people, they're not intelligent enough to be talking about tiers in the first place, honestly. But, so how much leeway do we give to, you know, stuff? Even when you think about a game like old school Street Fighter, they used to do tier lists for just trading, right? How many characters can win off a trade because damage was so important. And I remember that people used to talk about who are the best characters that can win off trades. You know what I mean? There were tier lists like that back in the day because it's such an important factor, like damage. If we were to talk about a game like Alpha 1, right? You know what I mean? The best characters in the game, Kin, Akuma, you know what I mean? And then you got a character like Guy, right? Why is Guy so good in that game, right? And I always say that Guy is one of the cheapest characters in the game. Because if you look at the game, the reason that Guy is so high on the tier list in that game, if you just play with him and, footsies and poking and stuff like that, it is kind of weird. I think it's kind of a little bit jarring if you played games like Super Turbo and old school Street Fighter. Like, I'm not saying footsies don't exist in Alpha 1 or Alpha 2, but if you just played Super Turbo recently and then you play like, Alpha 1 or Alpha 2 and you start playing like a good Japanese person playing as Akuma or Ken or something like that, Ryu, whatever it might be, you're like, wow, man, the way that Shoto's footsies work in Alpha, they are deceptively powerful. I always think about the Stand Strong, you know what I mean, in Alpha, because, it hits you ducking and it's just it's like a jarring move, I guess. If you haven't played Alpha in a while, and I'm not saying I don't appreciate the way that footsies work in Alpha 2 or Alpha 1, but, this is excluding custom combos. But, it can be kind of like, wow, man, Shotos their pokes, the way they poke is quite powerful feeling for a Shoto, right? It can be a little bit jarring if you're not like, if you haven't played Alpha in a while and you start to play like good Japanese, whatever it might be. But like I said, I played some pretty good Japanese back in the day when I was playing the game. But you look at a character like Guy, and I was using the comparison that like Guy, if you look at a character like Guy, you might think that Guy is a poking character like that. But if you look at him in Alpha 1, man, a lot of his pokes are complete crap to some of these characters. You got Duck Roundhouse. Duck Roundhouse is amazing in Alpha 1, right? And he's got some other pokes that are pretty good, but not exactly how the game is played, if that makes sense. Again, I don't want to get too deep into it. Like his flip kick is the priority on his flip kick is actually really good, actually, in Alpha 1, but there's not a lot of realistic ways to use it when you're playing the game in a real match. So again, this is kind of like nuanced, again, discussion. But when you compare a character like Guy and his pokes, a character that looks like he's a poking character, and then you start playing high level Japanese or something like that, you're like, wow, dude, my character's pokes. I'm not the poking character. I'm the cheap character. I'm considered a good character because I am so volatile, right? I do so much damage to you. I can win off a coin flip, right? That's why Guy is so high in a game like Alpha 1 because his damage is so explosive. You know what I mean? But then you look at a character, and I would say Alpha has this, there's like the hidden mind game of people that don't understand like the way that a game like Alpha 1 works is Alpha 1 has a bit of scrub-a-dub, run by the seat of your pants, whatever that is. That stupid kind of, coin flip mentality of, fuck, do I roll or do I not roll? Because good characters in that game kill you if they guess your roll. Because the most powerful combos in that game only work on characters if they're standing, and you punish rolls the guy is automatically standing. It's not like Alpha 2 where you have that safe little punch roll, generally safe quotation marks. When you roll, you commit to a roll in Alpha 1. And when you commit to the roll, a lot of the most powerful characters in the game can instantly kill you, like Akuma, right? So, and that's that whole reason, like the reason that Guy is annoying in that game is because Guy's overhead like dizzies you in 3 overheads. It's very fast, and he's safer at the advantage after. He can actually combo after it, if he does a meaty. So it's like, Guy, you run into this idea. It's like, well, fuck. Do I roll? If he guesses the roll, I could very well lose the match. If I don't roll, Guy has probably the best overhead in the game, and he actually has a legitimately kind of annoying high-low mix-up, right? So very volatile character, right? It's why he's so high. Why he's better than a character like, Rose. Rose is cheap as fuck. Rose kills you very fast too. But you know what? Guy does, Rose has better pokes than Guy, all this kind of stuff. But you know what? Guy's probably more volatile than Rose. That's probably why Guy is generally considered better than a character like Rose. As cheap as fucking Rose is, right? Because the damage factor is just that high. Anyway. Remember, if you like these videos, like, sub, silly, comment, share, support the channel if you want. Thanks.